And he was explaining that she was injured, when in fact the private secretary, Michael, was telling the six of us in the office that sadly she'd died.
For nearly 3 decades, he stayed quiet. While the world argued, speculated, and grieved, one man who was closer to Princess Diana than almost anyone simply chose silence. Not because he had nothing to say, but because some pain runs so deep that words feel inadequate. Colin Tebbit, Princess Diana's trusted personal driver for years, has finally decided to speak. And what he has to say doesn't just add detail to one of history's most heartbreaking nights. It fundamentally changes how we understand it. This is not a story about conspiracy theories or royal scandal. This is a story about a human being, a loyal servant, and a loss that never truly healed. To understand why Colin Tebbit's silence mattered, you first have to understand who he was to Diana. He wasn't simply an employee assigned to drive her from one engagement to another. Over the years he served her, Colin became one of those rare constants in Diana's life. Steady, discreet, and deeply trusted. In the complicated and often suffocating world of royal life, where loyalty was sometimes performance and privacy was nearly impossible, a driver represented something unusual. Someone who was always present but never intrusive. Someone who witnessed the unguarded moments but never exploited them. Colin drove Diana through the streets of London when she was at the peak of her global fame. He sat behind the wheel during school runs, charity visits, and private appointments. He witnessed her laugh, saw her exhausted after long days of public duty, and observed the quiet, contemplative woman that few people beyond the palace walls ever got to see. Diana was known for her warmth with staff, and by all accounts, her relationship with Colin reflected that. She treated those who worked for her with genuine kindness, often asking about their families, remembering small details, and acknowledging the humanity of the people who made her life function. That kind of relationship doesn't simply vanish when professional duties end. It leaves a mark. And so, when tragedy struck in the early hours of August 31st, 1997, Colin Tebbit wasn't just a staff member learning about the death of an employer. He was a person losing someone whose presence had shaped years of his life. The evening of August 30th, 1997 had been ordinary for Colin. He was at home, away from the royal schedules and the international spotlight that followed Diana wherever she went. It was a kind of quiet evening that people rarely remember, until something happens that makes every small detail suddenly vivid. He was not driving that night. Diana was in Paris with Dodi Fayed, accompanied by a different driver. For Colin, the evening held no sense of foreboding. There was no reason it should have. Then the phone rang. His wife answered first, exchanging what began as normal conversation with a colleague. But something shifted in the caller's voice, and she instinctively knew before she fully understood. She handed the phone to Colin and told him, simply, that he should sit down. That quiet warning, the kind that precedes news too heavy to receive standing, has stayed with him ever since. The voice on the other end of the line told him that Princess Diana had been involved in a serious car accident in Paris. The words arrived in his mind in pieces. An accident. Paris. Diana. Serious. The human brain, when confronted with news of this magnitude, often struggles to assemble it into coherent reality. Colin has described that moment as one of profound disorientation, a feeling that the floor had shifted beneath him even though he was sitting still. He turned to the television. The news was already breaking in real time, images flickering across the screen that confirmed what the phone call had only begun to communicate. The Ponta El Alma underpass, emergency vehicles, cameras fighting for position in the chaos. The world was waking up to something terrible, and Colin was waking up to it alone in his home, separated from the place where he felt his duty called him to be. What followed was not paralysis, but purpose. Even in grief, even in shock, Colin Tebbit was a professional who understood that there were things required of him. He began making preparations to leave. There would be no waiting, no watching from a distance. His place, as he understood it, was wherever he was needed most. Colin made his way first to Kensington Palace, the heart of Diana's world in London. The palace in those early morning hours was not the grand, composed institution it presented to the public. It was a place where shock had settled into every corridor, where staff moved with the heaviness of people who had received news they could not yet fully process. The tension was palpable, and the grief, though still raw and disorganized, was unmistakably real. It was there that Colin received the task that would define his experience of that night and the days that followed. He was to travel to Paris. He was to be part of the team responsible for bringing Princess Diana home. The weight of that assignment is difficult to overstate. In practical terms, it involved logistics, coordination, and the kind of measured professionalism that royal service demands even in moments of extremity. But in human terms, it meant something else entirely. It meant confronting, in the most direct and physical way possible, the reality that Diana was gone. It meant being present not for a living person, but for the preservation of her dignity in death. Colin boarded a plane to Paris, carrying the full weight of that responsibility. The flight itself must have felt suspended in time, too slow, too fast, too unreal. Outside the windows, the world was going about its early morning hours entirely unaware that one man on board was heading toward one of the most sorrowful duties of his life. When he arrived in France, the scale of the event was impossible to ignore. Paris had become, overnight, the center of global grief. Media from every country had descended on the city. Cameras pointed at every possible angle. Reporters broadcast in hushed, grave tones audiences around the world who had woken to news and couldn't look away. The chaos was not hostile but overwhelming, a crush of human attention focused on a single tragedy. Colin has spoken about the practical challenges he encountered navigating Paris in those circumstances. The language barrier presented genuine difficulty. He did not speak French fluently, and the systems he needed to interact with were not designed for foreign visitors arriving under extraordinary pressure. Support came through his wife's language skills and through a military attaché connection, Brigadier Ritchie, who helped provide a sense of familiar footing in deeply unfamiliar territory. In moments of crisis, those small anchors of connection matter enormously. The hospital where Diana had been taken, Pitié-Salpêtrière, one of Paris's oldest and most distinguished medical institutions, had been transformed by the night's events into something that defied easy description. It was simultaneously a place of medicine operating at the very edge of its capacity and a place of collective mourning. Staff moved with urgency. People who had nothing to do with the medical emergency stood nearby, drawn by grief and disbelief. The air was thick with the particular heaviness of a shared human catastrophe. For Colin, entering that environment was one of the most difficult moments of his life. He has spoken about it with the careful restraint of someone who knows that some experiences resist adequate description, that to try too hard to put them into words would somehow diminish rather than honor them. He was there not as a bystander, but as someone with defined purpose, and that purpose required him to function, even when every human instinct might have demanded otherwise. The medical team had been fighting for Diana's life through the night. Paramedics had worked at the crash scene before she was transported, and at the hospital, specialists took over in what became an increasingly desperate effort to stabilize a patient with catastrophic internal injuries. The internal bleeding was extensive. Her heart, under extraordinary strain from blood loss, was failing in ways that even the best surgical minds in France struggled to address. Colin learned, in the hours he spent navigating that hospital environment, something of what had transpired in those operating rooms. A torn pericardium, the membrane surrounding the heart, had complicated what was already a dire situation. Surgeons, including Professor Alan Pavey, a highly respected cardiac specialist, worked through the early morning hours attempting to locate and repair the damage. It was a race against biological reality, fought by people who were as skilled as the situation could demand. The efforts were relentless. Electric shocks were applied in attempts to restore heart rhythm. Every available intervention was deployed. And yet, at approximately 4 o'clock in the morning on August 31st, 1997, the battle ended. Princess Diana was pronounced dead. Colin was present in the vicinity of those events. He was not in the operating room, but he was close enough to feel the moment when the atmosphere changed, when urgency gave way to something quieter, heavier, and final. What happened next speaks volumes about who Colin Tebbit is, and what his years of service to Diana had made him. Rather than collapsing under grief, rather than being consumed by the shock, he turned his attention to the one thing he could still do: protect her dignity. The room where Diana's body lay was warm, uncomfortably so, without adequate ventilation. The windows lacked curtains. leaving her exposed to the possibility of outside observation in a city overrun with cameras and reporters. It was, in practical terms, inadequate to the solemnity of the moment. Colin improvised. He gathered blankets and used them to cover the windows, blocking the external gaze. He arranged for fans to ease the oppressive heat. These were not grand gestures. They were the quiet, practical actions of someone who understood that dignity is often built from small details, that respect is demonstrated in the way you treat a person when they can no longer advocate for themselves. He has recalled one particular moment with the kind of emotional precision that only comes from a memory burned permanently into the mind. As a fan moved the air in the room, Diana's eyelashes moved, nothing more than physics, the gentle displacement of air causing the smallest physical movement. But for a man who had known this woman, who had watched in 1,000 ordinary moments, it was devastating. The illusion of life in a place of death. He had to stop. He stepped away, allowed himself a moment of private grief, and then returned to finish what he had come to do. In the years since Diana's death, Colin Tebbit has wrestled with something that rational analysis cannot easily resolve: the guilt of not having been there. He was not driving on the night of August 31st. He was at home. Another driver was behind the wheel. And yet the question, what if I had been there, has followed him like a shadow through decades of life. This kind of guilt is not logical. Colin made no mistakes. He was not responsible for the decisions made that night in Paris. His absence was not negligence, but simply circumstance, the ordinary rotation of schedules and assignments that governs professional life. And yet grief rarely consults logic. Colin has spoken about this openly, with the honesty of someone who has spent years examining his own interior life and found that some questions don't resolve neatly. The guilt doesn't consume him, but it doesn't disappear either. It sits alongside everything else, alongside the warm memories, alongside the professional pride, alongside the grief. It is part of the full, complicated texture of what it means to have been close to someone who died too soon. His willingness to admit this publicly is significant. It would have been easier to present a version of himself that had processed and moved on. Instead, Colin has chosen honesty. He has chosen to say, "This happened, it changed me, and the changing is not finished." The years following Diana's death were not peaceful ones for those connected to her life. Public grief, when it has no clear target for its pain, sometimes transforms into suspicion. Questions multiplied. Theories circulated. In the absence of simple answers to an unbearable loss, people reached for explanations that might make sense of the senseless. Colin and others connected to Diana found themselves caught in the crossfire of that cultural phenomenon. Conspiracy theories implicated not just the famous and powerful, but also the ordinary professionals who had simply been present at one of history's most publicized tragedies. Operation Paget, the extensive investigation launched in the early 2000s and led by former Metropolitan Police Commissioner Lord John Stevens, eventually addressed many of these questions directly. The inquiry was thorough, detailed, and ultimately conclusive. The medical care Diana received was professional and appropriate. The people involved in her treatment conducted themselves with competence and dedication. The conspiracy theories that had caused so much additional pain to so many people were found to be without credible foundation. For Colin, the results provided something important, not vindication of personal wrongdoing, because there had been none, but confirmation that the truth was what it had always appeared to be. Colin Tebbit has spent nearly 30 years carrying what he carries. He has watched the world's relationship with Princess Diana evolve through documentaries and memoirs and films and anniversaries. He has seen her image reproduced and her story retold countless times, often by people who never met her. So why speak now? Why, after so many years of carefully maintained silence, choose this moment? Perhaps because silence, for all its protections, has costs. Perhaps because there are things about Diana, small, human, true things, that only the people closest to her actually knew, and those things deserve to exist in the record. Colin Tebbit is not a political figure or celebrity. He is not a person with an agenda. He is a man who knew and respected and quietly mourned someone who mattered enormously to the world, and who has decided, after long consideration, that the human reality of that loss deserves to be spoken aloud. Diana, Princess of Wales, was not just an icon. She was a person, warm, complicated, funny, serious, vulnerable, and genuinely kind to those around her. She was a woman whose laughter filled a car on an ordinary afternoon, who asked about the families of the people who served her, who could be both exhausted and magnificent in the same day. Colin Tebbit knew that person, and in breaking his silence, he honors not the legend, but the human being behind it. That is perhaps the greatest tribute a loyal driver can give. Not the polished story, but the true one,